Let's take a trip to Russia, specifically Moscow, the Kremlin. There, in the subterranean depths of the old Tsarist fortress, we discover a Soviet-style version of the George Washington Fan Club. They've come to celebrate the birthday of the first American president. On May Day, there they stand, making toasts and downing shots of vodka as they look admiringly at a portrait on the wall of Georgy Washingtonsky. The caption reads, "Father of Socialism." But this is not the Washington we have seen in so many portraits hanging on the walls of American schoolrooms. He sports a goatee, a thin mustache, and a monocle. Sans knee breeches and cockeyed hat, Washingtonsky wears heavy Russian boots and a woolen ushanka on his head. In his right hand, he carries a copy of Das Kapital, and in his left, the Communist Manifesto. What would be our reaction? Would we be pleased and proud to see that a whole troop of foreigners are so thoroughly devoted to preserving the memory of our first president? Or would we be inclined to suggest discreetly that they might be at least slightly off in their perceptions of the real Washington? Perhaps the best way for our Russian friends to get to know Washington would be to study a few things about the history and culture of colonial America. It might in fact be appropriate to become intimately acquainted with early American history, and for the most serious devotees, even to learn English. Why are we starting with a Russified version of George Washington in a lecture about Jesus? It's because there's a strange analogy to make here. Is it at least possible, if not highly likely, that the standard image of Jesus of Nazareth, complete with prototypical Caucasian features, has been similarly distorted over time? The answer is obvious. Most people, including devout Christians, are more than willing to acknowledge that there is almost certainly a real case here. What then, when it comes to the message of Jesus, which must certainly have been colored by his mindset, his religious devotion, namely ancient Judaism, and his political disposition? Does anybody have the chutzpah to suggest that Jesus was somehow outside of culture, not a part of it, not influenced by it? How much do we know about the Judaism of the era in which Jesus lived? What do we know about the politics of the age, the anti-Roman agitation that was rampant across the land of Israel, and the zealot movement that was gaining ground in those pivotal days? Bottom line, only when we have a good understanding of the multiple cultural, religious, and political currents of ancient Israel can we dare to approach the illustrious Nazarene. The next question is, why should we bother to learn about the historical Jesus and decode his life and teachings? Let's face it, many Christians will be scandalized by the very prospect of staring the real Jesus in the face. And by the same token, most Jews have no interest at all in encountering, much less understanding, the presumed founder of a non-Jewish faith, responsible for many centuries of anti-Jewish agitation, persecution, and virulent anti-Semitism, leading in the minds of some to the very gates of Auschwitz. The truth is, Jews and Christians alike need to confront the reality of Christian persecution of Jews in the heart of Christendom across many centuries. People are genuinely shocked to discover the outrages perpetrated against Jews in the name of Christ. The Crusades, in which vast Christian armies en route to the Holy Land descended upon hundreds of Jewish communities nestled along the Rhine and Danube river valleys, butchering Jews by the thousands. the Black Death, when the accusation spread that Jews had poisoned the water wells of Europe, providing an excuse for the murder of thousands more. The so-called blood libel, in which Jews were accused of kidnapping Christian children, killing them in mock crucifixions, and draining their blood for use in baking matzah crackers for Passover. If it weren't so tragic, it'd be funny. The desecration of the host, involving the accusation that Jews were sneaking into the cathedrals of Europe, pilfering the consecrated bread of the Holy Eucharist, tearing it up and stomping on it as yet another means of killing Christ. The disputations, when Judaism was essentially put on public trial in order to prove that Christianity is the true faith and that all Jews should see the light and convert. The Spanish Inquisition, involving horrible tortures of Jews who, in fear, had converted to Christianity, but whose conversions were deemed insincere. All of this culminated in the ultimate outrage, the total expulsion of the entire Jewish community from Spain, Christian Spain. In light of all this, we have to ask whether what Hitler did in exterminating 6 million Jews in the heart of Europe was really that different from what had gone on before. Or was he simply applying the anti-Semitism that had flourished for so many centuries with all the efficiency of a modern totalitarian state? Given such a legacy of intolerance, it's not surprising that 5 decades ago, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik produced a consequential essay entitled Confrontation. It expresses his deep skepticism about Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue, namely that ultimate religious beliefs can't be communicated or shared, and that dialogue often involves the need for religious or theological change, blurring the differences and leading to a loss of identity. Some contend that Christianity can only be defined by its hostility toward Judaism, being a supersessionist faith at its core. In other words, its adherents generally believe that it replaces Judaism. Reconciliation is just about impossible without the loss of identity of one faith or the other. Beyond that, the historical Jesus is deemed to be unrecoverable, essentially a construction of Christology. According to this view, the study of Christianity is important for the simple reason that it aids in understanding the unbridgeable divide between the two faiths, each being focused on their own claim of divine election. But we can nonetheless argue that dialogue should be distinguished from education, which really can become a vehicle for reconciliation. A case can in fact be made that the recovery of the Jewish Jesus is not only possible, at least to some extent, but an entirely appropriate academic pursuit. That doesn't mean that we come together to sit and argue religion, which one is best, and whether one person ought to convert to another's faith. Jews are, of course, forbidden from proselytizing, and Christians ought to know better than to try. But for many, this will be the first look at Jesus outside of a specifically religious context, and that's just fine. Another question for Jews to consider is whether it's necessary to devote any serious time to considering the presumed founder of a major non-Jewish faith, the concerns of which are largely, if not entirely, irrelevant to Jews today. Should Jesus be given more attention than, say, the Prophet Muhammad, the Buddha, or Lao Tzu, for that matter, given that Jews have certainly resided in many different lands, dominated by disparate religions throughout their history? A case will have to be made that Jesus of Nazareth, in history or in myth, is particularly important in understanding the Jewish people and of singular importance in appreciating the course and development of Jewish life, thought, and culture across the centuries. We can and should argue that failing to approach the Jesus of history and or myth amounts to a serious deficit in what has classically been termed the science of Judaism. Bottom line, when we study Jesus Judaically, we're not really studying the founder of a non-Jewish faith at all. We're learning the ins and outs of one of the most important moments in all of Jewish history. It has to do with King Herod the Great, the Romans, the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Essene sect, and two catastrophic revolts that turned Jerusalem's great temple into a smoldering ruin and turned ancient Israel into a wasteland. But it also laid the foundation for a new Judaism, based not on the blood of sacrificial animals, but on deeds of loving kindness. As we say in Hebrew, Gemilut Chasadim. In the final analysis, Jesus becomes a matrix for examining a whole gamut of religious, political, and cultural phenomena relevant not only to ancient Judaism, but to all of Jewish history to follow. Jews and Christians alike need to recognize that this topic is worth thinking about, worth studying in depth, and worth learning, and learning well.